Well, hello there, and welcome to Bloomwork. I'm Charlie Bloom.
Linda Bloom.
Linda. And we are here to be with you about one of our favorite subjects today. We call it Toto. And Toto means the tension of the opposites. And some of you may have heard that phrase before. If you haven't, you'll be a lot more aware of what we're talking about when we're done today. And if you have not been with us before, welcome. And I hope that you are enlightened by and enjoy the time that we're going to be spending with you today. So Toto is not about the Wizard of Oz. Even though you may be in Kansas, this is about something very different. It stands for holding the tension of the opposites, which has to do with being able to appreciate both sides of any situation, and to know that there are always two sides, and to also know that we all are kind of predisposed to have a certain preference for one side or the other. And that preference can sometimes distort our ability to appreciate the whole picture or to appreciate anything that doesn't enter into our view of things, which means that we don't always, even though we may think we do, we don't always have an accurate perception of what's actually happening, of what's going on, of what's needed. We don't have a complete picture because of this bias. We actually, those of you who are on our mailing list got a newsletter a few days ago in which we talked about something very much related to what we're going to be talking about today, which is what's known as confirmation bias. And that's the tendency to confirm or reinforce or validate anything that is consistent with what you already believe, and to invalidate anything that's inconsistent with that. So there are a few problems that can go along with that, particularly in terms of relationships, because in relationships, most of us find ourselves drawn to people who are not exactly like us. That's kind of an understatement. There's a saying that opposites attract. We like to see it more as complements attract. That is that if I have strengths in a certain area, I may be attracted to somebody, or somebody may be attracted to me because they may be deficient in some of those areas. And having somebody in their life who can offer a complementary perspective can enable them to have a more grounded, more accurate, more complete toolkit in order to deal with the challenges of life. So we're all predisposed to attract people who are not always on the same page. So it's predictable that if you're in relationship with somebody, you're going to have to deal with my point of view or your point of view. And today we're going to talk about the alternative to either this or that, to one way or another, to my way or the highway. Mm-hmm. We're gonna look at what's the alternative to that and why bother even doing that.
So the people who are here and the listening audience who know us, we're always trying to find the refinements to make relationships better, to ease relationship and communication, because sometimes they can be so challenging. Mm-hmm. Like Charlie was saying, we tend to be drawn to people who are very different than us. Some very wise part of ourselves, mostly unconscious, draws us to people who have different styles of being in the world. We are promoting taking on the challenge of holding the tension of the opposites to rise up to a more mature, responsible way of thinking. So instead of right and wrong, good and bad, black and white thinking, which can be very rigid and can make relationships difficult if we think our way of doing it is right and their way of doing it isn't right. That's option 1 and 2, good and bad, right and wrong. We're promoting a more creative option, option 3. How might we be more flexible in our thinking, bring the attitude of curiosity and wonder and a co-collaborative spirit so that we can co-create with each other something that can work with each other, work with together, so it works for both of us. And when we were most challenged by this, fortunately not so much nowadays, but in the early segment of our relationship, Charlie being the self-contained system and much more independent than myself, and I'm a big-time connector, love to talk, love to interact, and my way of being was all about connection, and he wasn't so much for collaboration. And there was a time when it got so intense and so polarized that I was making him really wrong about his way of doing his independent life so separate from me. And he was making me really wrong about being insecure and dependent and leaning too hard on him. And I'm willing to admit that when we were polarized, and it was nasty and intense, we were fighting a lot, I did hate his guts. And I was shocked to know that right next to the hate was love, that it didn't eclipse the love, that the hate was intense, and I really was fiercely, holding rigidly onto how right I was about the sanctity of the marriage and the family and so forth, and work shouldn't get this much attention. But when I could loosen up my grip and I could see that there was a lot that I could learn from Charlie about being more autonomous, being more self-sufficient, turning to other people and myself, deeper levels of myself when making decisions or to soothe myself. It was really wonderful for me. But I had to first learn how to hold the tension of the opposites and not go to the rigid right-wrong thinking that I was brought up with, that a lot of people think that way and they think their way is right. Or sometimes they think the other person's way is right and making yourself wrong. That's just as damaging. To be more open-minded and to have curious and wonder is to see if there are parts of the way they're viewing things and choices that they want to make that could enhance our life too, that we may have been closed to before.
Yeah, the loosening up your grip part of this equation is a lot easier said than done. And it's probably the most important aspect of the process. So for those of you who know what we're talking about from your own experience and have had your own version of, one of us is here and one of us is here, and we're both trying to get the other person over to our side. I mean, you know how painful that can be and how frustrating it can be. And sometimes we think that, well, I just need to try harder to get them to see it the right way, which is, of course,
how well does that work?
Yeah, and that generally is not a good strategy unless what you want is to end up, wanting to assassinate each other. But there are ways in which it is possible to begin to at least lighten the grip so that I'm not holding so tightly onto my view. Doesn't mean that I'm wrong. Doesn't mean that the other person's right. It's going beyond right or wrong and really looking at this from, is there any value or any truth in what the other person is saying? And is there anything about what I'm believing that is subject to being questioned? It's just taking very small steps, being open to the possibility that maybe not everything that they're saying is completely worthless, because when we can open even a little bit to their perspective, even if we don't totally agree with them, they're going to feel a little bit less defensive about having to hold on to their position. And when they feel that way, then they're going to loosen their grip. And when both of us can begin to be open to the possibility that there are ways to approach what we're dealing with other than one of us is right and one of us is wrong, then we open up the possibility of really being able to get creative and to see, well, what else could we come up with? And it's amazing how when people just can relax that tight grip enough to feel freer to begin to consider other ways of viewing it, how quickly new possibilities can come into being.
Mm-hmm. And all the work that you do about becoming more flexible, loosening your grip, cultivating a creative attitude towards the differences that you have in relationship holds you in good stead to have an open-minded, flexible attitude about our own beliefs. And cultivating a flexible, open-minded attitude about our own beliefs about ourselves has spillover effect to encourage flexibility and cooperation in our partnerships. So it works well. You can work it from both ends. I want to give a few examples just to concretize what we're talking about. Some people get a really rough start in life. They come from kooky families. Their parents were limited. No blame on the families. If they got better parenting, they would have given better parenting to us. Some people come out of families where there's alcoholic, drug addict, people who have mental illness, people who are preoccupied with their jobs because they're work addicted, and so they were neglected, sometimes abused. Could be sexual abuse, could be emotional abuse, could be physical abuse, and they get a really hard start in life. It's a large part of the population. Some people think it's third, some people think it's half, some people think it's the majority, depending on what study you read, but there are millions of people who at one point may have had a belief about themselves that they're damaged goods. Do you know that they're doomed in relationship? They're not going to be able to have a golden relationship because they didn't have good models when they were growing up, that they were slighted and didn't get the best possible start. If you can hold the tension of the opposites, yes, I got off to a bad start. I'm not denying that. That was really bona fide trouble. That was difficult. That was suffering. And it did take a toll. And also, there are benefits that I got from that. Learned about compassion, learned about self-responsibility, learned to reaching out outside my family to counselors or neighbors or teachers or coaches. And I did have some benefits. If people can look at the ways in which that hard time didn't ruin them or damage them or mar them, that there are also some gifts that came with that. And that they do not have to be defined by their past, that we are responsible to create a new present and a new future going forward. So that flexibility in thinking, not holding on to a white knuckle grip with our belief about ourselves, will really give us a perk up and give us an advantage in our life as an individual and give us an advantage in our life as a couple. Mm-hmm.
So if you are in a relationship right now with somebody and you notice that you have kind of locked yourself in on a particular perspective that has polarized the two of you in some way, that your attachment to being right about this has activated the other person's defensiveness and, of course, their attachment to not being made wrong or to being right about theirs, then you're in kind of a vicious cycle, that what you're both trying to do is actually amplifying the tension in the relationship. That's why, we talk about there is a certain tension involved in holding these two opposite views. And the way in which you can actually create an experience in which you see and experience your own power to influence this intractable situation is simply by recognizing where you have been attached, what it is that's causing you to feel the need to affirm your view, and there is a fear about what it is that your concern might happen if you were to loosen your grip, because as often there's a fear there. I need to hold on to this, because if I don't, this other person is going to think this, or they're going to act this way, or they're going to go way over to the other side, and it's only my resistance that's keeping them from completely going out of control here. I mean, as an example. But if you can recognize that, if you can acknowledge that to yourself, then take a look at what you might be able to do that could diminish that grip that you've got on needing to be right about that, and communicate that to your partner, just to give yourself the experience of seeing that I am in charge of how tightly I hold on to things. I'm the one who determines whether I'm willing to risk being more open, because being open means being vulnerable, and being vulnerable means that you're subject to having your feelings hurt, or to having some to feeling some difficulty, or creating a conflict, or getting into some kind of an uncomfortable position. But to see that if I can take that risk of letting my defensiveness down a little bit, letting my partner know that I'm willing to consider something about what they're saying as being valid, and that I can appreciate how they can see it that way. Very often when we can do that, that softens their rigid defensiveness, and they can not only appreciate that, but that often invites a similar response from them, one in which they can begin to expand their perspective and include the validity, perhaps seeing the validity of something that we're offering them. But one of us has got to take that first step.
Mm-hmm. So we know from our own experience in many couples that we've worked with over the years that this really, really works. Of course, it's easier to do when there's only a discrepancy or a difference that's smaller. And then the medium-sized ones, we can work up to those. But Charlie's talking about risking vulnerability. When we open up, when we let go of our rigid defensiveness, it's harder on the more medium-sized differences. We sometimes feel like if I back down on this, give them an inch, they're going to take a mile. So we can only be experimental. We can talk about how shaky it is to bring up the tough subjects, to try to deal with them and to open to each other's point of view. And in the most severe cases, and I'll give you an example, when there's been a betrayal, when there's been a serious breakdown of trust, when there's been a broken agreement, maybe it's misconduct about money or some kind of deceit, a lie, or an infidelity, those are about the most powerful differences that can occur in a partnership. And I heard Esther Perel being interviewed by her new book about affairs, and I totally agree with her. When there is a betrayal of that magnitude, the old relationship dies. And then you have to see whether you want to pick up the pieces and whether you want to create something new in the relationship, when it's the most severe form of trauma to the relationship. But in the most severe form of trauma, if you can hold the tension of the opposites, if you can realize that we're always doing the best we can at the level of consciousness that we've come to, then you can release the grip on right and wrong. You can move past the myth of once a cheater, always a cheater, I'm never going to give this person another chance, then there's room for forgiveness. There's room for learning. There's room for finding out how you might create something that's much sturdier, much stronger, much higher integrity than what it is that you were living before.
So holding on to some of those preconceived notions, those beliefs that we find security and comfort in, has its prices. And we may feel more secure in it because it's something that we feel is right, it's correct, it's true. We've been told that, we've been living that way. We don't want to be wrong about it. But the price that we pay for being rigidly attached to something that may at some point have had its validity, but life can change. It does change for us. And what was true at one point isn't always true at another point. And I'm not saying that, whatever feels good, just make that your current value. But what I am saying is that it really is important for us to be willing from time to time to reassess some of the things that we have held as truthful and correct, and be willing to reassess the validity of that. And it doesn't mean that we were wrong about it. What it does mean is that when new information comes to our attention, that we might want to shift or redefine some of our principles in a way that is congruent with our current reality. And given the fact that we have been, most of us, predisposed to bring somebody into our life who is going to offer different perspectives, we can either learn how to appreciate the differences, which means going beyond just accepting the differences, but really appreciating them, valuing them, and being grateful for the differences, because they help us to reconsider some things. Not saying that you have to buy into everything that your partner is saying or believing, but to be willing to risk lightening that grip and allowing that perspective to come in.
Mm-hmm. We both feel so strongly about how relationships are enhanced by having flexibility of mind and spaciousness of mind and curiosity and wonder as a guiding principle, that we wrote a book called 39 Happily Ever After and 39 Other Myths About Love, prompting people to take a look at the popular myths that have been running them, perhaps, and not necessarily give up their beliefs, but more deeply examine them to see if they're serving them or not serving them. Because some of the things we've just picked up along the way, and we haven't taken the time to see, is this really true for me? I'm operating as if this is true, but I haven't really examined it yet. And so this is finding the truth that may be in that myth, and then opening to, there may be something that's quite different, even quite opposite, even at the other pole, that may have some truth in it too. And we believe that it really will enhance your communication, will be richer, deeper, your understanding of each other's point of view will be much more tolerant and accepting and really respectful. And that's the stuff that great relationships are made of.
So like I said at the beginning of this talk, this is all well and good, and it's valuable, and it is easier said than done. Lightening up our grip, being more open, being more willing to be wrong, being more open to considering possible perspectives that are not completely consistent with our own. It does take work, and that's why it requires us, to be willing to put some time and effort into it. And one of the things that really helps us to find the motivation to do that, because if we don't have the motivation, we're probably going to get discouraged pretty quickly and either give up or just not really make our best effort. But one of the ways to find that motivation is to really get a clear picture in your own mind about what it is that could be possible for you and for your relationship if you were to be able to open and expand your mind, to become more open, to become more willing to listen rather than to get the other person to listen to you. If you were more willing to manage some of those defensive impulses that often come up when we hear people saying things that sound like we're being threatened or that feel like we're being made wrong, but to try to hold our ground even in the face of feeling anxious or upset or angry, but to stay focused on trying to understand where this person is coming from. Mm-hmm. If we can see what that could bring, the peace of mind that it could bring, the deepening of the appreciation and love in the relationship, the deepening of the trust in the relationship, the deepening of respect in the relationship. If we could, that would enhance our lives, our relationship, our families, even our world, that could make a huge difference. That can help us to find the motivation to take some of the risks that it's necessary to take to be this vulnerable, because that's really what we're talking about. It's a quality of vulnerability that opens us up to the possibility of being challenged.
In closing, I would just like to say a quick blessing of gratitude to Marion Woodman, who first turned me on to the whole idea of holding the tension of the opposites. I'm very grateful for her introducing the idea to me. And I don't want you to take our word for it. I want you to look to your own experience, especially the things that might annoy you or drive you a little nuts about your partner, to look at the other side of it and see if there's something that you might be able to learn from those things that are so irritating. And I want to encourage you to tell your friends about tuning in with us every single Thursday at 12:30. And I want you to know the topic for next week's talk is the real reason why I can't do what I know I need to do.
Until then.
See you next week.
Adios.